Well, as a citizen of a country that's allied to you guys, to the US, Australia, that's very close to China, that's not the most reassuring thing to hear. You're talking about, you went back to Russian capabilities. Can you tell me more about the Oreshnik missile? It's got the advanced maneuvering capabilities, which makes it very difficult for NATO to intercept. How concerning is that warhead?
Well, I think it's a very powerful weapon that could have a devastating impact in any war. The Oreshnik deploys multiple warheads accurately against a large set of targets. It's hypersonic. It moves at a speed that we cannot capture and then ultimately target effectively. And as you point out, all of this can be guided. I mean, one of the challenges for us, we've been working on hypersonic missiles as well, is maneuvering a hypersonic missile in flight. It's extremely difficult. They seem to have broken the code on this. So, I mean, you say concerning. I'd be very damn worried right now. I wouldn't want to go to war given the disparity in capability in rocketry and missile technology between ourselves, the Russians, and the Chinese.
Yeah, I remember the day that they deployed it in Dnipro. It was a pretty uneasy day for anyone that was watching. You also referenced what's happening between Israel and Iran, and I've been covering this extensively since the Qatar strike. First, we haven't spoken since the Qatar strike. What was your initial reaction? That was for me, that day was more shocking than when the Iran war broke out, because that's a U.S. ally. I know it's not a new war being struck, but everyone expected Israel and Iran to eventually, or to eventually potentially get into a war. But no one really expected, at least not me, expected Qatar to be struck, a U.S. ally with the biggest U.S. foreign base, to be struck by Israel.
Well, when this happened, I was a little surprised initially, and I asked the question repeatedly of the experts that I'm familiar with, how could this happen? Was Qatar fooled? Were they asleep at the switch? How did this occur? And ultimately, I was told by people who had worked in the region. These are Americans who've been intimately involved in air and missile defense technology in the Emirates and the Persian Gulf. And what they told me was that Qatar ultimately was aware that the Israelis were coming, because the quality of their air defenses and their radars and missiles are such that the Israelis could not have done that unless there was some sort of agreement in advance that they would not be attacked. In other words, Qatar was in on it. Now, of course, you have, as soon as the event is over, you have all the representatives of Qatar making all the usual speeches condemning, this event and condemning the Israelis and saying this is terrible and awful and on and on and on. But Qatar hasn't changed any of its policies. And as a result, I think probably the Israelis had a behind-the-scenes deal, could well have been brokered by us. The other thing is that initially we tried to act as though we knew nothing about it. Then subsequently, Israeli members of the government admitted, no, the U.S. was informed. Of course we were informed.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
And now we know that Royal Air Force tankers provided the refueling capacity in the air. So the British were involved. I think it's one. Now, these are the technical dimensions of the whole business. As far as the attack is concerned, I think everyone that might want to negotiate with Israel or us is probably going to have second thoughts in the future, because there's no evidence of any good faith whatsoever. Look what happened when the attack on Iran had begun. We were supposedly holding talks with the Iranians, and we acted as though, well, we knew nothing about this. Well, I don't think that's true either. So why would people in the future regard us as a credible negotiating partner? I don't think they will.
Why the discrepancy? That's what perplexes me. Why the discrepancy between what we're seeing in the Middle East, with the points you've made, that what Iran was, even Hezbollah was lured into that meeting where they killed Nasrallah and other leaders. So all these strikes were surprise strikes, very successful decapitation strikes. I think you might challenge how successful they are, but they include some sort of bad faith. One could make that argument. But it's opposite happening in Russia. Trump is opening the red carpet for Putin, meeting him in Alaska, and genuinely seeking peace. Why do you think that we are seeing those two different attempts, unless you disagree with what I just said?
Well, if he were genuinely seeking peace, we would have begun serious talks, and we would be well on our way to some sort of agreement. So I don't think that was ever serious at all. First, you got to understand something. This meeting was something we sought. Witkoff was suddenly put on a plane, shipped to Moscow. Please, please, please have a meeting with us. And the Russians said, okay, because they didn't want to be in the position of rejecting a meeting. But historically, meetings between heads of state are preceded by multiple meetings where the foundations for some sort of agreement are created. And the people that come into the final meeting come in with the final agreement in some form. They may hammer out minor details. But my point is that when you go into these kinds of meetings, you have studied the problem for a long time. You have studied your opponent's proposals, and you have your own proposals. And then you go back and forth until you work out an agreement. None of that happened. So it was unserious. And that's effectively what Vladimir Putin said. He said, it's very good to meet. We're glad we did that. These meetings are always helpful. However, nothing emerged from it. And there was still a failure to listen carefully or pay real attention to what the Russians had proposed. This goes all the way back to December of 2021, when they put together complete proposals for a new security architecture in Europe, a set of proposals that they asked us to examine. We never examined them. We refused to examine them. We hadn't examined anything in detail before that meeting. And I think President Trump wanted to do 3 or 4 things. First, he wanted good optics. This is the reality TV star. This is someone who understands the impact of images. He knows how to manipulate public opinion through images. So he sets this up at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, and he parks on either side of the red carpet all of these advanced combat aircraft, F-22s, F-35s, whatever they were. And then as he's greeting warmly Mr. Putin, across the sky flies a B-2 bomber with escorts. And Trump is conveying the impression that we are an all-powerful superpower, and that he's now deigning to meet with the president of Russia in order to seek peace. They go into a meeting. It's over in 2 hours. Why? Why did it end so quickly? Because Trump and his team had nothing to propose. Trump thought that he was going to overawe Vladimir Putin with his image, with his glittering personality, the force and power of Trump and the Trump myth, and that something good would come out of this, that he could get the Russians to back down from their positions and agree to a ceasefire. There was no chance of that. Absolutely not.
What's the disagreement? Because I think both leaders do want peace, but they just want it on different terms.
Well, the terms
everyone's debating what those terms are, but
listen, the terms on the Russian side are very clear. They have not been altered in any way. We have never addressed those terms. We keep saying we have to have a ceasefire. We have to have a ceasefire. Everybody's lost sight of the fact that you had a ceasefire in 1918 after you had a long period of negotiations and an agreement was reached. Then you got a ceasefire. You don't get a ceasefire in the middle of a war when there is no agreement to stop fighting. There's only an agreement for a temporary ceasefire. And the Russians have repeated over and over and over again, and in my judgment, justifiably, we want an agreement. We get an agreement, and we have guarantees that people will follow through on what they say, then we'll have a ceasefire. And they have stipulated what's important to them. We have not addressed any of those points. We keep arguing for a ceasefire. When we stop shooting, then we can talk. No, it doesn't work that way. It never has.
There's 2 other, it's kind of mixed messages over the last few days. You've got the improvements between the U.S.-Belarusian relations. Lukashenko, I think, released some political prisoners. And Trump said, after calling Lukashenko a highly respected leader, he said that they're looking at, I think, reopening the embassy or something along those lines. Yes, reopening the embassy. But on the other hand, you've got the Trump statement that his patience in an interview, I think yesterday, said his patience is running out with President Putin. What do you make of these 2 statements? The way I see it is that Trump seeks peace. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be the peace president. But Putin has, as you said, and I think we disagree on how much upper hand he has, but we both agree he has the upper hand on the ground. So Putin has the upper hand, and Putin has a stronger negotiating position, and that's making it difficult for Trump to find some sort of middle ground. Do you agree with that analysis? Or you have a different take on these two mixed messages? The running out of patience, peace with Belarus.
Depends on which audience he wants to address at any given point in time. He has a tendency to be somewhat schizophrenic when he approaches foreign policy. I mean, he'll say one thing one day and another 2 days later, and people are trying to figure out which one is true. Which direction do I go in? I think we're past the point of dealing with intentions. I have personally never doubted President Trump's intention to seek a peaceful solution in Ukraine. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But intentions don't count for much. That's the first thing. Actions are everything. This man, Zelensky, has treated Trump, in my judgment, with contempt and taken positions that President Trump on his best day could never support. And President Trump, for reasons that are unclear to me, has tolerated it. I don't know why. If you're really interested in peace, and great powers normally are interested in peace because they understand what a great power war means, usually tell a small country under a small leader like Mr. Zelensky to shut up, sit in the corner, and we'll tell you what the outcome looks like. That's what you do if you want peace. President Trump has the power as the president of the United States and the leader of NATO to do exactly that. Or, Mario, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he doesn't have that power. Maybe he doesn't have sufficient backing at home. Maybe he no longer controls NATO. NATO itself is no longer controlled. The globalist leaders in the West are now facing internal revolution at home. They can't possibly back down from the positions they've taken on Russia without complete loss of credibility. If you're Macron, or if you're Merz, or Donald Tusk in Poland, how do you turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, we really didn't tell you the truth. Russia doesn't want to conquer Europe. Russia isn't interested in going to war. We've been pushing this agenda for reasons that have nothing to do with our national interests, but we want to stay in power, because that's effectively what they're saying. Starmer's in the same boat. It's ridiculous. President Trump doesn't have to go that far. He's remote from it. But let's go back to something else that you brought up, which is very, very important. You said, well, Putin has the upper hand, at least on the ground. That's what counts, Mario. The rest of it is crap. Are we willing to fight in eastern Ukraine? Quick, tell me. Answer.
No, not with boots on the ground.
No.
Not with boots on the ground, that's for sure.
We're not going to put any troops on the ground. Absolutely not. We may have 100,000 troops sitting around in Poland and Lithuania and Romania. What they're doing is I have no idea. They don't have any military mission. They're not ready to fight anybody. They're the same old force that we've had for 30 years. They're not equipped for a new and different warfare. Now, we do have headquarters on the ground in Europe, one in Germany, from which we've been directing operations in Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine is really our war. We've just expended a lot of Ukrainian life in the process. But the point is, we're not going to fight on the ground. Are the Europeans going to fight on the ground? We've just had the president of Poland, Nawrocki, the new president, say, absolutely not. No Polish troops will go into Ukraine. Okay. So what are we going to do?
Economic pressure? See, like the last card that the West has, obviously there's no support for boots on the ground. I think we all agree, but the last card is economic pressure. Now, it's debatable how well it's working. It doesn't seem to be working too well. Now it's trying through India, but with India leaning more towards China and Russia, it doesn't look like this is working either.
Well, let's left? This is a very important point, and you're making the correct assessment. It doesn't work. What we're seeing happen in the world is a split between the Western financial system that has dominated the world, certainly since 1945. We did have this massive change undertaken under Nixon in '73 with abandoning the gold standard. But the bottom line is that we in the West, we're talking about basically London and New York City and Washington, we've controlled transactions, trade, financial operations around the world nonstop. That's ending. And so the world is splitting, and you have on this side now something we call BRICS. And BRICS, miraculously, in the last few years, has developed parallel institutions. They have the SWIFT equivalent that is actually faster, more convenient, and operates better than our own SWIFT system. In the meantime, we are losing ground because major powers in Asia, major powers in South America, major powers in Africa are moving away from us and moving towards BRICS. So we're looking at a split in the global financial system. If you take China, take India and Russia, now start adding Brazil and South Africa, and increasingly, I would argue, much of Africa, period. I think we're going to see the Saudis and others in the Middle East eventually migrate in the same direction. They're migrating away from us, and they're migrating in the direction of BRICS. This is an event that is almost, well, it probably is as important as 1492. Now people say, what do you mean 1492? Well, 1492 was the beginning of the end of Ottoman power in the Middle East because trade shifted. Gold, silver, wealth, power shifted away from the Middle East. And the Middle East was no longer capable of transporting and doing business between China, India, and the West. And the West now had a huge source of gold and income that came out of the New World. This promoted a complete split. And we saw the Western world take off. It took off for many reasons, but now in the Western world with all of that wealth, there was a huge demand for science and technology and commerce. We're seeing something similar to that happen today. Only it's not because we discovered a new civilization or a new country halfway around the world. It's not because we got to Mars and landed there and found something new. It's because China, India, most of Asia, most of Africa, and increasing large portions of South America are all moving away from us into a new gold-backed system of currencies. And we and our West Europeans, maybe some East Europeans, but certainly West Europeans, are standing around wondering, where are we headed? And where is Australia going to go? Or New Zealand? Where do they migrate? Are they going to sit with us? Or are they going to migrate in a different direction? I think all of these things have to be viewed against the backdrop of everything we're discussing. This isn't just about what's going to happen in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is effectively over. The Russians have won. They will determine what happens in Eastern and Western Ukraine. That's coming. And eventually the people that live on that border, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and Moldova, they're all going to have to do business with the Russians, whether they like it or not. Hungary knows that. Slovakia knows that. Romania knows that, but they were cheated out of their electoral victory by a globalist. But the globalists are on the run. They're in retreat. They're going to lose power. It'll be interesting to see what happens after that. Now, I can't predict what happens with us, those who are not in BRICS and part of it. I don't know what we'll do. I don't think we can go to a gold-backed system. I'm not sure that we have enough gold to do it. Maybe we're talking about a digitization, digital currency. I have no idea. But what I'm saying is this split is a function of everything happening, not only in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. And if you notice something else, Mr. Trump has made it increasingly clear that he is largely disinterested in going to war with China. That's very important. Remember we had this pivot to China. We have to pivot to China.
Yeah.
It never happened.
And what was Biden's statement? Would you defend Taiwan if China invests Taiwan? The answer was direct yes in that interview.
No.
That was under Biden administration, but since now it's less hawkish towards China.
Yeah. Oh, I think Donald Trump wants nothing to do with a war against China. If anything, I think right now in the White House, he and his little band of advisors are trying to figure out how do we get out from underneath this terrible tariff war. You know, this tariff war has done nothing but destruction. You know,
I feel like we're pushing. Let me know what you think of this. It seems that the US is doing this to itself. It's pushed Russia and India to China by, through the Ukraine war, by NATO's expansion. It pushed, it potentially is going to push Arab countries towards China. They're all going to be very upset what's happening in Gaza. And now they're striking Qatar. They're not going to be too happy. All the Gulf countries are uniting. Saudi, the UAE, which are rivals to Qatar, are now standing by Qatar's side. And with the tariff war, it's pushed, historically US allies to kind of seek alternatives. It looks like it's a self-inflicting wound. maybe we can revert course. I'm saying maybe as in us, you know, the US and allies, maybe we can revert course and kind of fix a lot of those issues. Ukraine war ends and maybe normalize relations with India again, sort out all the tariff issues, normalize relations with Russia. There's hope there. Hopefully the war in Gaza ends soon, doesn't look too good there. And maybe things normalize in the Middle East, but it just keeps getting worse and worse.
Yeah, I think it's going to get a little worse over the next few months because we have a financial system in the United States that is just as fragile as the financial system in Great Britain and the financial system in France and Germany. We're all bound up together in this catastrophe. They're ahead of us. In other words, they're preceding us on the path down to hell, but we'll get there. And it's only when you're finally in hell and you look around and say, gee, didn't want to get here. Now I want to get out. That's when things will change. Now, things will change faster once that decision is made in Europe because they have parliamentary systems and they can toss governments out and bring new governments in and get new leadership almost overnight. We're not organized that way. So it's going to be much harder here in the United States when it strikes.
What do you make of the name change as well from the Department of Defense, renaming it back to the Department of War? Optics, anything meant behind it?
I can't conceive of anything less significant and less important than this. Now, let me back up a minute and explain something, because I know this is important to President Trump, and I happen to agree with him in this sense. He's been very frustrated with an American military establishment that has focused on all of this interventionism and nation building. And it became sort of painfully politically correct. I mean, I can go back 50 years to the decision to integrate women into the service academies and then bringing more and more women into the armed forces has absolutely done nothing for our readiness or warfighting capability at all. Anybody that's remotely honest will tell you the truth. That's been very, very bad. And if you look at other nations that are maintaining effective armed forces, a good example, of course, are the Russians. They do not integrate women into those formations. They know the risks involved. It makes no sense. And so you have a problem where the young men that we used to set out to attract into the military, they're not showing up. Because you turn to an 18, 19, 20-year-old man who's in reasonably good physical shape, who wants to challenge a military service, who wants to prove himself as a man in his youth. And he's told, well, who are you? You're no good. This little 100-pound female is 5'4", is just as good as you are. Well, if she's just as good as I am, then you don't need me. Mm-hmm. So the whole fabric of military service has been dangerously weakened. President Trump understands that. He's trying to get this war-fighting focus back into people's minds. But changing a name does nothing. I understand what he's thinking. But, I could turn around and say, well, Mario, from now on, your name is Rudolph. You're still Mario, right? It's not going to change anything.
Doesn't make me a German expert.
Yeah, whatever. But, it's silly. It's silly in that sense. But I do understand what lies beneath his reasoning. And he's frustrated with that. That's why he was very frustrated with the senior officers.